What does a man who can buy the world do when he finds out he broke the only part of it that mattered? He was a ghost, a titan of industry hiding in plain sight, a man named Silas Kane. Dressed in the rags of a drifter, he walked into a forgotten diner in a forgotten town, a small piece of a vast empire he owned but had never seen. He was there to judge its worth in dollars and cents. But the only currency that would matter by the end of this day wasn't gold. It was tears. He ordered a simple meal, ready to pass his silent judgment, but he stopped when a sound drifted from the kitchen, the sound of a woman's quiet, desperate sob. The man who called himself Caleb limped into Redemption Gulch on a Tuesday. The name was a lie, as were the threadbare coat, the scuffed boots, and the weary slump in his shoulders. In reality, he was Silas Kane, a man whose true name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the financial heart of Denver and the gilded halls of San Francisco. His signature on a piece of paper could build a railroad, dam a river, or bankrupt a lesser man. His empire, Kane Consolidated, had its fingers in everything from mining and lumber to banking and land speculation. Redemption Gulch was one of his more recent and insignificant acquisitions. He'd bought the entire valley, including the town, as part of a larger land package for its water rights, barely glancing at the manifest. The town itself was a rounding error in his ledgers, but a disturbing report of diminishing returns from the local businesses he now technically owned had piqued his curiosity. He believed in one thing above all else: a man must inspect his own property. So he had shed the skin of Silas Kane and donned the disguise of Caleb, a down-on-his-luck ranch hand looking for odd jobs. The town was aptly named. It looked like it was in a permanent state of seeking redemption for some long-forgotten sin. Dust, the color of rust, coated everything: the tired wooden storefronts, the empty horse troughs, the very air itself. It was a place where hope came to die, or at least to wither under the relentless glare of the afternoon sun. His destination was a small eatery on the main street, the Junction Diner. The sign was sun-bleached, the paint flaking. According to his records, it was the only profitable establishment in town, though barely. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival with a tired jingle. The inside was clean but worn. The scent of stale coffee, fried bacon, and something vaguely sweet hung in the air. A handful of patrons, a grizzled prospector, two ranch hands arguing over a map, and a stoic-looking sheriff nursing a coffee, were scattered among the wooden tables. Then he saw her. She moved between the tables with a practiced efficiency that couldn't quite hide the bone-deep weariness in her posture. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with straw-colored hair pinned up haphazardly, a few strands escaping to frame a face that was pretty despite its paleness and the faint dark circles under her eyes. Her blue gingham dress was faded from 1,000 washings, but immaculately clean. She smiled at the customers, but it was a brittle thing, a mask that didn't reach her haunted sky-blue eyes. Silas took a seat in a booth by the window, the cracked leather sighing under his weight. The waitress approached, her notepad in hand. "Afternoon," she said, her voice soft but clear. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee, black," Silas grunted, keeping his gaze low. "And the stew, if it's fresh." "It is. Made it myself this morning," she replied, a flicker of pride in her tone. "Be right up." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen pass-through. Silas watched her, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He wasn't a man given to sentiment. People were assets or liabilities. This woman was an asset, efficient, clean, polite. The diner, however, was on the brink of becoming a liability. He was here to find out why. He sipped the coffee she brought. It was strong and hot, a far cry from the refined blends served in his Denver club, but it was honest coffee. As he waited for his meal, he listened. The ranch hands grumbled about the price of feed. The prospector muttered to himself about a vein that was playing out. The sheriff, a man named Brody with a face like a roadmap of disappointments, said nothing, just stared out the window. The waitress returned with a steaming bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. "Enjoy," she said with that same fragile smile. Silas nodded and dug in. The stew was surprisingly good. Rich, flavorful, with tender chunks of meat and vegetables. This was not the slop he had expected from a failing business. The food was good, the service was prompt, the place was clean. So where was the leak? Where was the money going? He was halfway through his meal, his mind sorting through balance sheets and potential scenarios, when he heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a small choke sound, barely audible over the clatter of cutlery and low conversation. It came from the kitchen, through the pass-through window. He paused, his spoon hovering over the bowl, and listened intently. There it was again. A stifled sob, the sound of someone trying desperately to cry in secret, to swallow their grief before it could escape. He glanced around the diner. No one else seemed to have noticed, or, if they had, they were practiced in the art of ignoring the sorrows of others. But Silas Kane had not built an empire by ignoring the details. He had an obsessive need to understand the gears of any machine he owned, and this diner, this town, was his machine. And a crying employee was a faulty gear. He set his spoon down, the rich stew suddenly tasteless in his mouth. His mission had just changed. It was no longer about profit and loss. It was about the source of that sound. He needed to know why the woman with the haunted eyes, the one who made honest stew in a dishonest world, was crying like her heart was breaking in the kitchen of his diner. Silas finished his stew, his mind a whirl of calculation. He lingered over his coffee, nursing the cup, his ears strained to catch another sound from the kitchen. The crying had stopped, replaced by the clatter of pots and pans, a sound of forced, almost frantic activity. He was a patient man. He could wait. His opportunity came when the two ranch hands finished their meal, tossed a few coins on the table, and ambled out. Clara May, as he'd heard the prospector call her, cleared their plates. As she turned toward the kitchen, her foot caught on an uneven floorboard. It was a slight stumble, but she was carrying a heavy load. One of the ceramic plates slid from the stack, hung in the air for a breathless moment, and then shattered on the wooden floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet diner. Every head turned. Clara May froze, her face draining of all color. She looked at the white shards on the floor as if they were a coiled rattlesnake. Before she could even bend to pick them up, a man emerged from a back office. He was stout, with a florid face and small piggy eyes that darted around the room, assessing the situation instantly. He wore a waistcoat that was too tight, and a film of sweat glistened on his upper lip, despite the relative cool of the diner. This, Silas surmised, must be the manager, Bartholomew Bart Higgins. Clara May! Higgins's voice was oily but carried a sharp, menacing edge. What in blazes was that? That's the third plate this month. I'm sorry, Mr. Higgins, she whispered, her voice trembling. She knelt, her hands shaking as she began to gather the larger pieces. The floorboard. It's loose. I tripped. Excuses, Higgins sneered, keeping his voice just low enough not to be considered a full-blown spectacle. That plate cost money. Good money. And since you seem to have a habit of destroying company property, it's only fair that you pay for it. Clara May looked up, her blue eyes wide with panic. Pay for it, but it was an accident. Accidents cost money, Higgins said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cruel whisper that Silas had to strain to hear. I'll be docking it from your wages at the end of the week. 2 bits. 2 bits! The whisper was now a strangled cry. Mr. Higgins, please. I can't. I need every cent. You know I do. Leo's medicine? Your boy's troubles are not my own, Higgins cut her off coldly. Perhaps if you were more careful, you'd have more money for what's important to you. Now clean this mess up before you drive away what few customers we have left. He shot a venomous glance around the room, daring anyone to interfere. The prospector suddenly found the bottom of his coffee cup fascinating. Sheriff Brody took a long, slow sip, his eyes fixed on the street outside. They were residents of this town, and they knew the unspoken rules. Bart Higgins was a man you didn't cross over small matters. Silas watched the entire exchange, his face an impassive mask, but behind his eyes a storm was brewing. This was the leak. It wasn't a flaw in the business model. It was a maggot in the apple. This petty tyrant was bleeding his employees dry. 2 bits for a plate. It was an insignificant sum to Silas Kane, but to this woman it was clearly a lifeline. Clara May didn't argue further. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound and devastating resignation. She finished cleaning the shards, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and disappeared back into the kitchen. A moment later, the sound returned. It was the same sound he'd heard before, but this time it was raw, stripped of any attempt to conceal it. It was the sound of utter despair. Silas Kane sat perfectly still. He had seen grown men weep in his boardroom after he had financially ruined them. He had seen desperation in the eyes of strikers at his mines. But those were distant, abstract conflicts, the necessary collateral damage of building an empire. This was different. This was immediate, personal, and profoundly ugly. It was happening in his establishment, under his roof. He placed a silver dollar on the table, a ridiculous overpayment for a simple meal, but he wanted to see what would happen. He stood up, his limp slightly more pronounced, and walked toward the door. Higgins' beady eyes snapped to the silver dollar, a flicker of greed flashing across his face. He intercepted Silas before he reached the door. "Everything to your satisfaction, sir?" Higgins asked, his tone now slick and sycophantic. Silas looked him up and down, his gaze cold and flat. The stew was fine. The service was good. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. The management, however, leaves something to be desired. Higgins' smile faltered. I don't know what you mean, sir." "Don't you?" Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't raise it, but it held a weight that made the manager take an involuntary step back. A good manager knows that his most valuable asset isn't the plates, it's the people who carry them. Without another word, Silas Kane, the drifter named Caleb, pushed open the door and stepped back out into the dusty street. He knew the source of the crying now. He had found the faulty gear. But as he looked at the bleak, unforgiving landscape of Redemption Gulch, he had a feeling the problem ran much deeper than a single broken plate. And he, the silent owner, was just beginning to understand the true cost of doing business in a town that had forgotten its own name. Silas Kane didn't leave Redemption Gulch. The discovery in the diner had hooked into him like a barbed arrow. A simple inspection of a minor asset had morphed into something else entirely. It was now a puzzle, and Silas detested unsolved puzzles, especially when they took place on his own property. The woman's cry, the manager's cruelty, it was a symptom of a deeper sickness. He decided to stay, to diagnose the disease before cutting it out. He took a room at the town's only boarding house, a rickety two-story building run by a hawk-faced widow named Mrs. Gable. He paid in cash and claimed he was waiting for a message about a cattle drive job. It was a plausible enough story in this part of the country. His days fell into a quiet routine of observation. He spent his mornings walking the town's 3 dusty streets, his limp a convincing part of his disguise. He was a ghost, present but unseen, his plain appearance making him part of the drab scenery. He listened to the conversations in the general store, at the blacksmith's, and in the evenings, at the saloon. He wasn't prying, he was collecting data. He learned that Clara Mae Thompson was a widow. Her husband, Daniel, had been a miner, killed in a shaft collapse a year prior. She was left alone with their young son, Leo, who, the town gossips whispered, had been sickly ever since the shock of his father's death. "Lung fever," one woman said at the dry goods counter. "Wasting away," said another. Her story was the town's quiet tragedy, but the focus of most conversations was on the town's slow decay. The Northridge mine, once the lifeblood of the region, had scaled back its operations significantly after the collapse, putting most of the men out of work. The parent company, Kane Consolidated, a name spoken with a distant, resentful ignorance, had paid a pittance in compensation and then seemed to forget Redemption Gulch existed. A bitter irony began to dawn on Silas. He was the faceless villain in their story. His investigation inevitably led him to the other names he'd heard whispered: Bart Higgins and a man called Doc Finch. Higgins, he discovered, was more than just the diner manager. He was the town's de facto gatekeeper of employment. He managed the diner, oversaw the boarding house for Mrs. Gable, taking a hefty cut, and had a hand in the livery stable. If you needed a job in Redemption Gulch, you went through Bart Higgins. And Higgins, the whisper said, always made sure he got his share, and then some. Doc Finch was an even more insidious figure. He wasn't a real doctor, but an apothecary who had drifted into town a few years back. With no other medical help for 100 miles, he had a captive audience. He operated out of a small dark shop filled with dusty bottles and the cloying smell of herbs. Silas, complaining of a sore back from his long ride, paid him a visit. Finch was a thin, weaselly man with watery eyes and stained fingers. He sold Silas a worthless liniment for an exorbitant price, all while extolling its miraculous properties. As Silas paid, he casually mentioned the Thompson boy. "Tragic case," Silas said, shaking his head. "Heard the boy's got lung fever. Must be hard on the mother, finding money for medicine." Doc Finch's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "Oh, it is. The tincture he needs is a very complex compound. The ingredients are rare, have to be shipped in from the East. Very costly." Silas knew a lie when he heard one. He had financed pharmaceutical companies. He knew the base components for respiratory ailments were common and cheap. Finch was a charlatan, a vulture preying on desperation. The pieces began to click into place, forming a grim picture. A sick boy, a desperate mother, a greedy manager docking her pay, and a quack doctor charging a fortune for medicine. It was a closed loop of exploitation. Higgins kept Clara May poor and desperate, and Finch bled her dry of whatever she managed to earn. They were two parasites feeding on the same host. One afternoon, Silas followed Clara May after her shift at the diner. She didn't go straight home. Her path took her to Doc Finch's apothecary. She was inside for less than 5 minutes. When she emerged, her face was paler than ever, her hands clutching a small corked bottle. She then walked to the edge of town, to a small, tidy cabin with a well-tended but struggling garden out front. Silas saw a small, pale face peer out the window before disappearing again. That must be Leo. The sight of it all, the desperation, the predatory opportunism, the quiet suffering stirred something cold and unfamiliar in Silas's gut. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a starving boy on the streets of the Five Points in New York, watching the powerful and wealthy crush the weak without a second thought. He had become the very thing he once despised, a distant, careless power that allowed men like Higgins and Finch to fester in the shadows of his empire. He sat on a crate outside the general store, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the sunset was a stark contrast to the ugliness he had uncovered. He had come to Redemption Gulch to fix a minor financial leak. He had found instead a moral rot that spread through the entire town. And it was all happening on his land, in his town, affecting the widow of a man who had died in his mine. The responsibility felt heavier than all the gold in his vaults. He had gathered the facts. The time for observation was over. The time for action was approaching. He would not just prune a branch, he would pull the whole rotten tree out by its roots, and he would do it in a way that Redemption Gulch, Bart Higgins, and Doc Finch would never forget. The next morning, Silas Kane walked not to the diner or the saloon, but to the town's small telegraph office. It was housed in a corner of the train station, a station that saw only one freight train a week and no passenger service. The operator, a young man with a green eye shade and an air of perpetual boredom, looked up as Silas entered. "Need to send a wire," Silas said in his gravelly Caleb voice. He wrote out the message on a slip of paper. It was coded. A cipher he and his chief legal counsel in Denver, a man named Alistair Wright, had developed years ago for sensitive communications. To the young operator, it would look like gibberish. To Wright, it would be an urgent, high-priority command. The message was concise. It requested all files pertaining to the Northridge mine, specifically the operational status, payroll records, and, most importantly, the full incident report on the shaft collapse of the previous year. He wanted the name of every man who had died, the cause of the accident, and the compensation paid to the families. He added a second, more pointed request, a thorough background check on 2 individuals in Redemption Gulch, Bartholomew Higgins and a man known as Doc Finch. He gave the operator enough cash to cover the transmission and a generous tip to ensure it was sent immediately. "This is coming from Denver," the operator noted, impressed by the length and cost. "Must be important." "Life and death," Silas muttered, turning to leave. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 days, Silas existed in a state of suspended animation. He continued his charade as Caleb, taking his meals at the diner, observing Clara May's quiet, desperate struggle. He saw the toll his investigation was taking on her. She was thinner, her movements more frantic. Once he saw her stumble again and catch herself, a wave of pure terror washing over her face at the thought of breaking another plate. The sight twisted the cold knot in his stomach even tighter. On the third day, the return telegram arrived. The operator, now seeing Caleb as a man of some mystery, handed over the sealed envelope with a newfound respect. Silas took it back to his room at the boarding house, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. He slit the envelope open with his pocket knife. The message was long, decoded from Wright's cipher into neat, clear script. He read the reports on Higgins and Finch first. They were exactly what he expected. Higgins had a history of embezzlement in 2 other towns before landing in Redemption Gulch, where he'd seemingly gone straight until now. Finch, whose real name was Phineas Webb, was a failed medical student and a known peddler of patent medicines, wanted for fraud in the state of Missouri. They were common criminals, parasites easily dealt with. He set those papers aside. Then he turned to the file on the Northridge mine. He read through the operational summaries, the declining ore quality, the rising costs. His own signature was at the bottom of a memo authorizing a series of efficiency-improving budget cuts 3 months before the accident. The cuts included a reduction in the timber budget for shoring up tunnels and a halt on new equipment purchases. It was a standard, bloodless business decision made from 1,000 miles away to protect the profit margin of a C-list asset. His hands began to tremble, a rare show of emotion for the iron-willed Silas Kane. He felt a chill creep over him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He forced himself to read the incident report. The language was sterile, technical. Geological instability in shaft 4. Structural failure of support beams. Subsequent collapse. It listed the casualties. 6 men. Their names blurred before his eyes until one leaped out from the page as if written in fire. Daniel Thompson, age 28, survived by wife Clara May Thompson and son Leo Thompson. The report went on. The official cause was listed as an unforeseeable geological event. But Silas knew better. He held the memo in his other hand. Reduction in timber budget. Structural failure of support beams. It wasn't unforeseeable. It was inevitable. It was a direct consequence of his order, an order he had likely signed between sipping his morning coffee and planning a lavish dinner party. The world, which had always seemed so solid and controllable, tilted on its axis. The sterile report, the profit margins, the coded telegrams, it all dissolved, leaving behind a devastatingly simple truth. He hadn't just stumbled upon a woman's quiet tragedy. He had authored it. He was the reason her husband was dead. He was the reason her son was growing up without a father. He was the architect of the very desperation that allowed vermin like Higgins and Finch to thrive. His quest to fix a small leak in his vast empire had led him directly to the gaping, mortal wound he himself had inflicted. The ghost of Silas Kane, the man who owned everything, sat in the cheap boarding house room, the flimsy papers shaking in his hand. The disguise of Caleb felt less like a costume and more like the worthless, hollowed-out man he now knew himself to be. The crying he had heard in the kitchen was no longer just a mystery to be solved. It was an accusation. It was the sound of a life he had personally, if unknowingly, shattered. And for the first time in his adult life, the great Silas Kane had no idea what to do next. The revelation shattered Silas Kane's carefully constructed world. For a full day, he remained in his room, the telegram spread on the bed like a judgment. Guilt was a foreign country to him. He had always seen business as a battlefield with unavoidable casualties. But the name Daniel Thompson, linked forever to Clara May's haunted eyes and Leo's pale face, was not a casualty. He was a man, a husband, a father. And Silas had killed him as surely as if he'd swung the pickaxe that brought the tunnel down. His period of paralysis ended as the sun set on the second day. The guilt did not recede, but it crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. Atonement was not enough. What was required was a reckoning. He emerged from the boarding house a changed man. The shuffling, weary disguise of Caleb was gone. Though still dressed in the same worn clothes, he stood straighter. The slump was gone from his shoulders, replaced by an iron rigidity. The weary look in his eyes had been supplanted by a glacial fire. The ghost of Redemption Gulch was about to become its god. His first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork, surprised by the forceful entry of the quiet drifter. "Brody," Silas said, his voice no longer the gravelly mutter of Caleb, but the clipped, authoritative tone that commanded boardrooms. "My name is Silas Kane." Brody's eyes widened slightly. The name was known, even out here. The name of the faceless owner of everything. Silas didn't wait for a response. He tossed a sheaf of telegrams onto the desk. "This is a warrant for the arrest of a Phineas Webb, also known as Doc Finch, for fraud in the state of Missouri. I expect you to execute it. This," he added, placing another paper on top, "is a detailed account of embezzlement and wage theft perpetrated by Bartholomew Higgins at my diner. You will find his books have been cooked. My accountants can prove it." He pointed a finger at the stunned sheriff. "I am giving you a choice. You can be the man who cleans up this town, or you can be the man who stood by and let it rot. If you choose the latter, I will own your badge by morning. If you choose the former, this town will see a future you cannot yet imagine. Your move." Brody, a man who had long ago surrendered to the town's apathy, looked at the papers, then at the burning intensity in Kane's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the badge on his chest. He slowly stood up, a new purpose dawning on his face. "I'll deputize 2 men at the saloon. We'll pay a visit to Mr. Webb." "Good," Silas said. "Meet me at the diner in 1 hour. We'll deal with Higgins then." Silas walked to the Junction Diner. It was the dinner rush, such as it was. Clara May was a blur of motion, her face tight with stress. Higgins was hovering near the cash box, his piggy eyes watching every transaction. Silas took his usual booth. When Clara May approached, he looked her directly in the eye. "Just a coffee, please, ma'am." His voice, his posture, was so different that she faltered for a second, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She nodded and brought the coffee. Silas waited. He drank the coffee slowly, a predator watching his prey. He saw Higgins pocket a coin from the register when he thought no one was looking. He saw him berate Clara May for being too slow with an order. Each transgression was fuel for the fire burning in Silas's chest. Just as the sun bled its last light from the sky, the diner door opened. Sheriff Brody entered, flanked by 2 grim-faced ranch hands now wearing deputy badges. They moved to stand silently by the door, blocking the only exit. The handful of remaining patrons froze, spoons and forks hovering in midair. Higgins spun around, his face paling. "Sheriff, what's the meaning of this?" "Just ensuring the peace, Bart," Brody said, his voice carrying a newfound authority. Silas Kane rose slowly from his booth. All eyes in the room turned to him. He was no longer Caleb the Drifter. He was a figure of immense power, and everyone in the room could feel it. He walked to the counter, his limp completely gone. He stood before the sputtering, terrified manager. "Mr. Higgins," Silas began, his voice dangerously calm. "I am Silas Kane, and you are standing in my diner." Higgins's jaw dropped. He looked from Silas to the sheriff and back again, comprehension and terror dawning on his face. "We have a few things to discuss," Silas continued, his voice dropping. "Let's start with the cost of a broken plate. You charge Mrs. Thompson 2 bits for a plate that cost my company less than a nickel. That is theft. A small theft, but it speaks to a larger pattern." Silas's hand shot out and grabbed the ledger from under the counter. He opened it. "My accountants in Denver have analyzed your weekly reports. You've been skimming, Bart, 10% off the top for the last 6 months. You've been stealing from me, and you've been using your position to terrorize your staff." It's a lie, a misunderstanding," Higgins stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Is it?" Silas's voice was like chipping ice. "Is it a misunderstanding that you conspire with a charlatan named Phineas Webb to gouge a grieving mother for worthless medicine? He preys on her fear, and you make sure she's too poor to go anywhere else or to question the price." Clara May, standing frozen by a table, let out a small gasp. Her head whipped between Silas and Higgins, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "Sheriff," Silas said, not taking his eyes off the crumbling manager. Mr. Higgins will be accompanying you. He will be charged with embezzlement, theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His assets will be frozen, and every cent he has stolen from Mrs. Thompson through docked wages and predatory schemes will be returned to her with interest. Brody stepped forward. Bartholomew Higgins, you're under arrest. Higgins didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a cornered rat. As the deputies led him away, a stunned silence fell over the diner. The patrons stared, wide-eyed. Silas turned his attention to them. For those of you who watched this happen day after day and did nothing, let this be a lesson. A town is only as strong as its willingness to protect its own. The rot stops today. His gaze finally settled on Clara May. She was standing by a table, her hand covering her mouth, her blue eyes filled with a whirlwind of shock, confusion, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The public reckoning was over, but the private one, the one that truly mattered, had just begun. After the deputies had dragged a blubbering Higgins out into the night, an awkward silence descended upon the Junction diner. The few remaining patrons, sensing this was no longer a public spectacle, quietly paid for their meals, leaving the coins on their tables, and scurried out, leaving Silas and Clara May alone in the lamplit room. The air was thick with unanswered questions. Clara May hadn't moved. She stood as if rooted to the floor, her mind reeling. The drifter Caleb was Silas Kane, the powerful, almost mythical owner of the mine, the town, this very diner. The man who had just dismantled her tormentor with a few quiet words was the same man she had served coffee to for days. Mrs. Thompson, Silas said, his voice softer now, stripped of the icy authority he had used on Higgins. Please, sit. He gestured to the booth he had just vacated. Hesitantly, she moved toward it and slid onto the worn leather bench, perching on the edge as if ready to flee. He sat opposite her, the table between them feeling like a vast canyon. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why? Why would you? I came to Redemption Gulch to inspect my properties, he began, his gaze fixed on his hands which rested on the table. He could not bring himself to look at her yet. I was looking for financial discrepancies. Instead, I found a deep and personal injustice. What you endured at the hands of Higgins and Finch was unconscionable. I have dealt with them. Doc Finch, or rather Phineas Webb, is in custody. A real doctor from Denver will be here on the morning train to look after your son, at my personal expense. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not the tears of sorrow he had first heard. They were tears of shock and overwhelming relief. A real doctor? For Leo? The hope in her voice was a sharp pang in his chest. Thank you. Sir, I don't have the words. You've saved us. This was his chance. He could accept her gratitude, be the benevolent savior, and walk away with a clear, if heavy, conscience. But that would be the ultimate lie. The reckoning was not complete until he faced his own verdict. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. No, he said, his voice thick with a pain that stunned her into silence. Do not thank me, Mrs. Thompson. I have done nothing to earn your gratitude. I am not your savior. I am the man responsible for your suffering. Clara May recoiled slightly, confusion clouding her features. What are you saying? You just arrested the man who made my life a misery. Higgins was a symptom, Silas said, forcing the words out, each one a stone in his throat. I am the disease. I have read the report on the North Ridge mine collapse, the report on your husband, Daniel. At the mention of her husband's name, a fresh wave of grief washed over her face. She hugged her arms to her chest. The official report called it a geological event, Silas continued, his voice cracking slightly. It was a lie. It was a budget cut, a decision I made, a signature I scribbled on a memo 1,000 miles from here to save a paltry sum of money on timber supports for the tunnels. I weakened the mine, Mrs. Thompson. I sent your husband and 5 other men into a tunnel that I knew was not as safe as it should have been. I traded their lives for a number on a ledger. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the oil lamps. Clara May stared at him, her face a mask of dawning horror. The relief in her eyes was extinguished. replaced by a storm of conflicting emotions. Disbelief, confusion, and the slow, rising tide of a terrible, profound anger. "You," she whispered, the single word filled with a year's worth of compressed agony. "You're the one?" "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. He didn't flinch from her gaze. He owed her that much. "I am the reason your son doesn't have a father. I am the reason you have had to work your fingers to the bone just to be preyed upon by vultures like Higgins. My greed, my carelessness, created the circumstances that have nearly destroyed you. Hearing you cry in the kitchen, it was like hearing the echo of my own sin." Tears now streamed freely down her face, hot and bitter. It was too much to comprehend. The man who had just offered her salvation was also the author of her damnation. Her hands clenched into fists on the table. "I hate you," she breathed, the words raw and ragged. "All this time I cursed the mountain. I cursed God. But it was you, a man in an office, signing a piece of paper." "Yes," Silas affirmed, accepting her hatred as his due, "and I will not ask for your forgiveness. It is not mine to ask for. I can never give you back what I took from you. I cannot bring Daniel back." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading with her to understand, not to forgive. "But what I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it, not with empty words, but with action. The new doctor for Leo is just the beginning. I am reopening the North Ridge mine, but with new leadership and the highest safety standards in the country. The families of every man who died will be given a lifetime pension, starting with you. I am building a proper clinic in this town and a school. Redemption Gulch will no longer be a forgotten place where my company lets people suffer." He finally looked away, his confession complete. "And this diner, it's yours, not to manage but to own. I will sign the deed over to you. You will never have to answer to another man like Higgins again." Clara May was silent for a long time, her tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She looked at this powerful, broken man before her. She saw not the monster who had signed her husband's death warrant, but a man drowning in a guilt so profound it had reshaped him. Her hatred was real, a living fire inside her. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else. He hadn't hidden. He hadn't justified. He had confessed, and he had taken responsibility in the only way he knew how. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "Why tell me? You could have just been the hero and left." "Because," Silas Kane said, his voice barely a whisper, "you deserve to know the truth. And I could not live another day as the man I was." The canyon between them remained, but for the first time, a fragile bridge of truth had been thrown across it. It was not a bridge of forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the quiet of the empty diner, amidst the wreckage of their lives, two souls bound by a terrible tragedy took the first painful step toward a new, uncertain future. The sound that heralded the new era of Redemption Gulch was not a gunshot or a proclamation, but the lonely whistle of a locomotive slicing through the crisp morning air. It was an unfamiliar sound for a weekday, and it drew people from their homes, shading their eyes as the morning train, a symbol of a world far removed from their own, chugged into the station. It brought with it more than just mail and cargo. It carried the first tangible proof of Silas Kane's vow. Dr. Adams was the first to disembark, a man whose neat, dark suit and polished leather medical bag seemed to belong to a different century. He moved with a quiet purpose that stood in stark contrast to the town's weary languor. Silas met him on the platform, and after a brief, low-voiced exchange, pointed the doctor towards the small cabin on the edge of town. Silas did not accompany him. He understood with a clarity that was both new and painful that his presence in Clara May's home would be an intrusion, a shadow falling upon a space that was already filled with too many ghosts of his making. Instead, he waited. He stood near the town's water tower, a solitary figure watching the cabin from a distance, feeling like a sentry guarding a peace he had no right to share. He could picture the scene inside. Clara May's hands twisting in her apron, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs as this stranger from the city examined her son. Every passing minute was an exercise in torment for him, a fresh realization that his power could command trains and doctors, but it could not grant him the right to offer simple comfort. Inside the cabin, Clara May felt suspended in time. Dr. Adams was nothing like the greasy, cloying Phineas Webb. His hands were clean, his voice was calm, and he spoke to Leo not as a collection of symptoms, but as a child. He listened to the boy's faint, rattling breaths with a stethoscope, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was gentle, thorough, and for the first time in a year, Clara May felt a flicker of something she had long since abandoned: trust. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Adams straightened up and turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, and her heart seized, bracing for the worst. "Your son has a severe and persistent bronchial infection. It's been left untreated for far too long, and it's been aggravated by malnutrition." He saw the terror in her eyes and quickly added, "But it is treatable, entirely treatable. It is not the fatal wasting sickness you were led to believe. With the proper medication, which I have with me, consistent nutrition, and clean air, he is going to make a full recovery." The words didn't register at first. They seemed like a foreign language. Full recovery. She swayed on her feet, a hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that was not of grief, but of a relief so profound it was physically painful. The dam of her composure, which had held through poverty, fear, and anger, finally broke. She collapsed into a chair, her body shaking as a year of suffocating dread was released in a flood of silent, cleansing tears. Dr. Adams quietly left a series of labeled bottles on the table and let her weep, understanding that this was a medicine he could not provide. While this quiet miracle unfolded, Silas Kane waged his own war from the telegraph office. The young operator, who had once viewed Caleb as a curiosity, now worked the key with a trembling, fearful reverence. The messages Silas dictated were seismic shocks sent down the wire, destined to topple the comfortable, careless structures he himself had built. He fired the entire regional management team of Kane Consolidated, his words cold and unforgiving. He ordered a full, independent safety audit of every mine bearing his name. He dictated the formation of a Newtown trust for Redemption Gulch, seeding it with a sum of money that made the operator's eyes bulge. Then came the most important message. "To all divisions," he dictated, "effective immediately, implement the Thompson mandate. All operations will adhere to a new primary directive. Worker safety will, under all circumstances, supersede profit projections. Any manager found compromising safety for production will face immediate termination and legal action. No exceptions, no excuses." He was not just making a new rule, he was carving a tombstone for the man he used to be. Late that afternoon, another train arrived, this one a special charter. Alistair Wright, his chief counsel, and a man who navigated the treacherous waters of corporate law with surgical precision, stepped onto the platform. He found his employer not in a fine suit, but in the clothes of a common laborer, his face etched with a gravity Wright had never seen before. "Silas," Wright began, his voice laced with concern, "your telegrams are causing chaos. The board thinks you've lost your mind." "On the contrary, Alistair," Silas replied, his gaze sweeping over the dusty town. "I believe I've only just found it. Come, we have work to do." He led Wright to the diner and into the small, grimy back office that had been Higgins's domain. The room still smelled of his cheap cigars and desperation. Spreading the legal documents Wright had brought on the cluttered desk, Silas began to sign. With each stroke of his pen, he dismantled a piece of his old empire and repurposed it for atonement. He signed the deed to the Junction Diner and a generous parcel of the surrounding land, transferring ownership to Clara May Thompson. He signed the documents establishing a lifelong pension for her and an ironclad educational trust for Leo. His signature, once a weapon of corporate conquest, was now a tool of restitution. As evening approached, casting long shadows across the diner floor, he found Clara May sweeping, the familiar motion a small anchor in a day of overwhelming change. She looked up as he approached, her eyes clear of tears, holding a quiet, guarded strength. He held the portfolio of documents out to her. "These are for you, Mrs. Thompson," he said. The formal title felt necessary, a mark of the respect he had failed to show her in his ignorance. The deed to this diner is in here, the legal confirmation of the pension and the trust for your son. It's all yours." She wiped her hands on her apron before reaching for the papers, her touch hesitant. She looked from the thick legal documents to his face, and for a long moment, the silence in the diner was filled with the unspoken weight of all that had happened between them. "Last night," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I hated you more than I have ever hated anyone. Today, a doctor you sent saved my son's life." She took a deep breath, grappling with the impossible contradiction. "I cannot forgive you, Mr. Kane. Perhaps I never will. Forgiveness is for God to decide. What you took from me, what you took from Daniel, that is a hole that no amount of money or property can ever fill." "I know," Silas said, his voice a low whisper of acceptance. "I do not ask for it. But," she continued, her gaze unwavering as she clutched the papers to her chest, "I will accept this. My Daniel, he was a builder. He loved seeing things made strong and right. He would never have wanted his memory to be a reason for his son to suffer. He would have wanted this." She looked around the diner, her diner, a town where people are looked after, a place where a boy can get well and have a future. "I am accepting this for the future Daniel was denied, and for the future Leo will now have." Her words were not an absolution, but something far more profound, a recognition that life, however broken, had to go on. It was a form of grace, forged in the heart of tragedy. Silas Kane left on the first train the next morning. He sat in a common car among prospectors and farmers, just another passenger watching the world go by. As the train pulled away, he looked out the window one last time at Redemption Gulch. He did not see a failed asset. He saw a town stirring with a new sense of purpose. He saw the first light of dawn touching the rooftops, painting the dusty street in hues of golden rose. And on the porch of the Junction Diner, he saw Clara May. She stood tall, a cup of coffee steaming in her hand. Beside her, wrapped in a thick blanket, sat Leo, his small face turned toward the warmth of the rising sun. They were not watching him leave. They were facing the beginning of their new day. Silas turned from the window, a man stripped of his arrogance, but clothed in a new, heavier mantle of purpose. He had come to this town to claim what was his. He left having finally understood the immense debt he owed. The story of Silas Kane and Clara May Thompson is a powerful reminder that behind every ledger, every profit margin, and every distant decision, there are human lives. It shows us that true redemption isn't found in wealth or power, but in facing the truths we've tried to bury and taking meaningful action to heal the wounds we've caused. It's a story about how a single quiet sob can be louder than a roaring locomotive, powerful enough to change the course of a man's soul and a town's destiny. It reminds us that even in the dustiest, most forgotten corners of the world, there is always the chance for a new sunrise. If this story of justice, accountability, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the depths of the human heart. Your support helps us bring stories like this to life. Thank you for listening.